This is Learning Science Unpacked, a podcast mini-series from Sponge, dedicated to unpacking the science behind how we learn and behave. Over the next few sessions, I'll be digging deep into the science of learning with Professor Paul Howard-Jones, an educational neuroscientist at Bristol University. Together, we'll uncover the most effective strategies workplace learning professionals can use to optimise learning for performance, something we do at Sponge every day. We're going to talk about the brain today, and who better to talk about the brain with me than you? Hopefully you can help give us a bit of an orientation of some of the key functions that we are kind of excited about for learning and creativity. And I thought we could begin. Perhaps you could just tell us, do we know much about the brain yet, or are we still learning about it?
Well, I think both those things are true. I mean, we know so much more about the brain than we did 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that's largely due to the fact that we have neuroimaging techniques. So whereas once it was the case that we had to wait for people to fall off, mopeds and motorcycles or whatever and see what happens to their brain when it's damaged, which is one of the reasons why, by the way, so much neuroscience came out of Italy at one point, because they weren't using crash helmets.
Oh, wow.
It's a very slow and somewhat crude way to learn about brain function. But with the advent of in vivo imaging, so that you can actually see the brain functioning in healthy participants, the amount that we know has really exploded. And I mean, first of all, it started off with identifying parts of the brain that were particularly involved with specific types of basic function. And then it's moved on now. So we're looking much more at connectivity and the different ways in which different parts of the brain interconnect with each other in order to support particular mental functions. So it's no longer just about which bits, but which bits are talking to which other bits, if you like. So massive amount. But I mean, I think it's not the problem. Maybe one of the exciting things, I won't call it a problem, but one of the exciting things about it in a way is that the more we find out, the more questions we have. And it is such a complex, it's such a complex concept, really, the brain. So I don't think we're in any danger of reaching the limits of what needs to be understood, not for a very long time. And there are still some really basic questions like, what is consciousness and how should we think about free will in the brain and those sorts of issues, which are really fundamental. And personally, I feel we're just scratching the surface, really, in terms of those sorts of questions. So I think it's going to be a very long time yet before we can say, we really understand how the brain works. But we have learnt so much.
And we have the tools to be able to continue learning, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And they are also developing. I mean, new imaging techniques all the time as well. Let's not forget that. And particularly, what I find particularly exciting in terms of education and learning is the beginnings of some of these portable ones, so that you can actually carry them around with you and have them connected when you're actually engaging in a real world learning or training context. So, yeah, I mean, very exciting.
Otherwise, it's all lab studies and the context and environment is false, really, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there are always going to be potential, sort of criticisms of those sorts of studies. People can say, well, that's,
not the real world.
Yeah, you're being creative inside a huge magnet while you're listening to 120 decibels of noise, and is that really what I do when I'm in my office or lying on my bed thinking up new ideas?
Well, if we wanted to get started and, let's say we didn't really know much about the brain at all, what would be the best place to begin? Can you orient us to the sort of basic structures of a human brain?
Yes. So I think possibly, there are several places. I mean, different people have, different scientists actually have different favourite parts of the brain.
Okay.
I'm particularly interested in the reward system, but I'm going to try to not be biased by that, really. Just think about, well, what's the most important things in terms of how we learn? I think the frontal cortices are the sort of go-to place in terms of thinking about our conscious reasoning, and perhaps the temporal lobes here on either side for declarative memory formation. So declarative memory is our memory that can be explicit. So anything that we can utter, like facts or knowledge, that's declarative memory. So temporal lobes, very important for that type of memory, but the frontal lobes, so important for identifying goals and thinking about how we're going to achieve those goals. Very important in terms of reasoning, very important in terms of working memory as well, which is our limited ability to hold particular things in our consciousness, which is around about sort of 7 items of information at once. That's what we call the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is this bit here, and that part increases its activity whenever we do anything which is particularly challenging. Yes, the sort of conscious reasoning is very much to do with this front part of the brain, the frontal lobes. But then there are other parts which are really important as well. I mean, the parietal lobes, which are further towards the back, very important for a whole range of automatic processing, including language, but actually in a more general sense, what they do, or one really important thing that happens here is a combining together of information from a lot of different senses. So we're not aware that that's happening, but that's a really important part. That's a really important function. So there's quite a few things happening back here that we're not even aware of. And then right at the back, we've got the occipital lobes, which is mostly about visual processing, which seems really odd because your eyes are at the front and yet your occipital lobes are at the back. So occipital lobes important for visual, parietal lobes important for a lot of automatic processing, including bringing together information from different senses. Temporal lobes, very important for declarative memory. Frontal lobes, most important part really in terms of for reasoning. These are the parts which are the go-to area for educators and trainers, I would say, be the frontal lobes. But that's just the wrinkly cortex. That's just the part that you can see. I should also mention this part here, which is the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum, we used to think that was all about quite basic motor, movement, sort of sensory motor type sort of function. For example, really important for your balance, and they always said, oh, that's why dogs have got a very large cerebellum because they're very good at balancing or whatever. But actually, we're beginning to learn that this has got a lot of very important cognitive function, cognitive functionality as well. I mean, for example, in terms of timing, so a lot of timing information, very important for us understanding speech, musicality, those sorts of things are going on in the cerebellum as well. So let's not be disrespectful. I think, this is one of these areas where probably there's an awful lot of work to be done in terms of understanding its importance. It's a bit of a sort of a dark area at the moment, but we're finding out more about it. But those are the visible areas.
Okay, so just the basic structure is there are 2 hemispheres, right? And in the middle, corpus
yes, I'm
callosum.
Going to split it up.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Here it comes. Here it comes. Oh, it's now in 2 halves, 2 hemispheres. What have I done? To do that, I would have to have broken the corpus callosum, which is this part here, which is this is like an information superhighway that basically interconnects the 2 hemispheres. So, it is true that there is some what we call laterality insofar as there are some things you actually use the left hemisphere more than the right hemisphere. So language, for example, is very much left lateralized in many respects, but not entirely. So.
Do you mind holding it up a little bit more, Paul? Sorry, brilliant.
So it's very easy to fall into this trap of thinking, left hemisphere, this is all about, science and things and logic, mathematics. And then, we've got the right hemisphere, which is all about creativity. And that is a massive oversimplification. I mean, even for the simplest task, like, picking up something with your hand, you're actually, if I just pick up this glass case, for example, just that simple act will have, if you could see the activity that was involved with that, it would look like sort of shimmering light all over the hemisphere. In terms of, planning, so you've got premotor cortex here, and then there's information in terms of what you're seeing, so it's visual cortex going to be activating, and then, I'm going to be sort of thinking about the texture of the glass case as well, so that's information from another sense. That's going to be coming together in the parietal lobes, and then, of course, there's the memory of is it my glass case? Have I seen this before or not? And that's going to be engaging the temporal lobe. So it would be like flashing all over, just picking up that glasses case, which is, so let's not fall into this trap of thinking that, every simple little thing we do has a little place in the brain that allows that to happen. It's very integrated in that sense. And that corpus callosum brings together the two hemispheres. So let's not think that, maths is all about the left hemisphere, art's all about the right hemisphere, and either your left brain or your right brain. That really doesn't make sense.
Okay. Well, that's really good. So we have this, and actually the brain that you're holding there, is that the size of a human brain? And how heavy is it? How heavy is a real human brain? It's
probably not the size of my brain. My brain is bigger than most. That sounds terribly boastful.
How have you achieved this? All these degrees and masters and PhDs, isn't it, Paul?
There's a very weak relationship between IQ and brain size, but it is actually just because I have a very large skull. That's all there is to it. There's no, for example, women have smaller brains, yes, but there's no difference in IQ or lots of those cognitive functions that we value so highly. So size doesn't matter from that point of view. But yeah, that's about the size of it.
Okay. And it weighs about how much? Just, curious.
It's heavy because it actually uses so much energy compared with the rest of the body. I couldn't put a figure on it.
No.
But okay. It's a very energy consuming.
I've heard the brain takes about 20% of our energy. Is that true?
Yeah, it is around about that because it actually, as a species, it has grown quite large. Although let's not get carried away with ourselves because, for a primate of our size, with a brain this size, it's actually completely in proportion to what you would expect. So some people fall into this trap of thinking, our forebrain has expanded massively relative to the less important parts, let's say the cerebellum. But actually, that's not really true. It's really the brain that you would expect for a primate with a brain of our size. So yeah.
So all is well with the scale of the brain in the human. And if we were to kind of look underneath the wrinkly cortex, we know that there are some particularly important areas for learning and laying down memories and things. Could you show us those and talk us through those a bit?
Well, these are a bit more difficult to show in terms of this brain, but we've been talking about the cortical areas, the wrinkly bits that you can see. But underneath this wrinkly cortex, you've got these subcortical structures, and they're smaller. They're quite complex, real variety of different shapes and sizes. And I think there's at least three types of structure which are really important for learning. And there's a left and a right for these, so they sort of extend into where I can't sort of show you in this particular plastic brain. But we've got the amygdala, which is really important emotional center. It tends to be associated more with negative emotions, like an aversive sort of fear response. But actually, it's involved with a range of different emotions, not just fear. And then there's also the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is right bang next door to the amygdala. And the hippocampus is important for laying down memory. And there's a reason why those two structures are so close together, because they need to communicate very rapidly. And that's the basis, if you like, of emotional memory. So, we know that things that stimulate our emotions are more memorable. And that sort of emotional tagging takes place due to that interaction between the amygdala and the hippocampus.
Do you think that's evolutionary? So I was thinking about this and I was imagining if I'd found some really tasty berries or something, you'd want to remember where those were. And so that kind of combination was helpful for survival in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, there is this very strong association with the amygdala with fear conditioning, which has been studied a lot. And this basic structure of the amygdala and the hippocampus, I mean, this goes back a long way. So we can find something similar in jawless fishes going back hundreds of years ago, because that's one of the most important things for survival, isn't it? Is having a bad experience suddenly thrust upon you and knowing what to do about it. so yeah, it's a really fundamental organizing principle is having that amygdala and the hippocampus close together.
And what else do we need to know about in there? I hear people calling this as the limbic system. Is that right? And there's the thalamus in there and the hypothalamus. Are they of interest to us or?
Well, no, they are. Well, they're interest to me.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, so the amygdala is part of what's sometimes referred to as the limbic system. I mean, the limbic system kind of refers to like an emotional processing system. But we don't tend to use the word limbic quite so much now in the modern literature. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we don't really want to submit too much to this idea that there is an emotional processing system, which is apart from the rest of the brain, because actually emotions appear to be processed in a distributed fashion across the brain. But yes, there are other structures which certainly are of interest to me. I mean, the reward system is one of the most important, I think, and that's actually a variety of different structures. It includes part of the cortex, but also a region called the striatum. And underneath, or right at the sort of lower part of the striatum, the ventral striatum, we have a little P-shaped structure on either side, about the size of a P, a bit more elongated, and that's called the nucleus accumbens. And I love that region of the brain because the more you want something, the more it activates, and it seems to bring together a whole load of different stimuli in that. We sex, drugs, rock and roll have all been measured in brain scanners. Don't ask me how, but that will activate in response to how much you want that stimulus. But also we see it activating in learning. And I think that's important to point out because this is a very visceral sort of response that we're talking about, wanting food, wanting learning can be just as visceral in that sense. So curiosity, for example, seeing something that makes you interested will activate the nucleus accumbens. And it kind of reminds us that there's quite a visceral side to learning. It's not all about this conscious reasoning in the frontal cortex. Yeah. Our emotions are actually really important for motivating us. And we should never forget that emotional side to learning. And I think that's one of the really important reasons why the brain should be included in us thinking about how we learn and how we engage with technology and training, because you can't leave your emotions behind. They're intertwined, whether we're talking about this close connection between the amygdala and the hippocampus, which helps us explain a lot how we quickly gain an aversive reaction to something which we're not enjoying, or whether we're actually talking about, the nucleus accumbens that we know can activate in response to just how much we're desiring something in a visceral sense. So, it strongly activates during video games, for example.
And what about, we hear a lot the role of dopamine. When does that happen and how does that affect the sort of that neurotransmitter? How does that kind of come into play?
Well, so dopamine is the neurotransmitter of choice in the media. We hear a lot about dopamine. I mean, I almost hear people who use this. I'm probably sensitized to it, so I pick it out more. But this idea of a dopamine hit, everyone's heard of this dopamine hit. I think we have to remember that actually dopamine is one type of neurotransmitter of many, and it serves a variety of different purposes.
And sorry, Paul, just for those that might not know, what's a neurotransmitter?
So a neurotransmitter is a chemical that essentially has a very important role in sending signals between neurons. But it also is a neuromodulator, which means it can actually affect the way other chemicals are playing that role as well. But the particular type of path, dopamine path that we're interested in is a Mesolimbic dopaminergic pathway, which is involving that nucleus accumbens, that very bit that activates whenever you want something, and it draws up when you want something. Dopamine is drawn up from deep down in the midbrain, down here, and it comes up into the nucleus accumbens and beyond into the cortex. And one of the reasons why that's an important thing to know is that dopamine, as well as signaling, our desire in that part of the brain, it also increases neuroplasticity, including in the cortex as well. So we're more likely to be making connections in our cortex when we are being stimulated in that visceral sense towards something because we want it.
So this is, if we're thinking kind of about learning, then we imagine a learning experience that is emotionally resonant, that creates this dopamine release if it's engaging. Nucleus accumbens. No, is that right? Yeah.
Nucleus. Yes, very good. Nucleus accumbens activated.
That's activated. Yeah. And our brain is actually, when you say increases brain plasticity, does that mean it's sort of softening? And what does that mean?
Yeah, well, that in a way is the holy grail, because how do we learn? We learn by neurons changing their connections with each other. And that's the sort of neural plasticity that we're talking about. So plasticity is not about plastic in the normal sense. We're referring to it in terms of the ability to change. So it's that ability of neurons to change their connections, their synapses, which is the basis of learning. So if you can just increase the rate at which that happens, then you're essentially accelerating the learning process. So that's why the role of dopamine in this sense is potentially very important, because it's increasing your ability to be able to learn. You're going to learn more rapidly. And we have actually demonstrated this in different ways. We've done something in our lab that's sort of shown that by estimating the amount of let's say, nucleus accumbens activity, essentially, what we were estimating using a computational model, that was a better predictor of how much was going to be learned during a learning game than just looking at the points that were being won. It's not the points that are being won in an educational game. It's actually the likely effect of that on the reward system. And when you put that into the equation, you get a better prediction of learning.
So would it be right to say, in simple terms, the sort of happier and more engaged we are in something, the more we will learn?
No, no. Sorry, you're very almost there. So one thing I haven't mentioned is that we're talking about wanting, and I think in normal life we tend to use wanting and liking as the same thing. Actually, these are two different brain systems. So you're almost right, but it's not so much how much we're enjoying something; it's how much we want it, which is what makes the difference. Now, generally speaking, if you've enjoyed something, you want more of it, but it's not quite that simple. For example, if you keep scoring the same number of points or you keep getting the same reward, then you become habituated to that and your reward signal goes down. Another thing to know about the reward system is that the uncertainty of the reward in terms of it having some element of luck or chance increases the response of the reward system. There's lots of things like that which are just really good to know. Another one is the maximum dopamine release is actually proportional to the maximum reward available in that context. And so you can change the context and then increase the dopamine response and the likelihood of remembering. I mean, this is a basic principle of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, for example. You start off with I don't watch it that much, but you start off with it. Basically, you get accumulating amounts of reward. You start off with 50 quid, is it 100 quid, 1,000 quid, and 2,000 quid, and it's sort of accumulating. And one of the clever things about that is that you're essentially changing the context. So if you didn't do that and you were just winning 50 quid each time, then the reward system response would eventually go down, because the amount of reward that you're anticipating is the same. And it's actually the difference between what you've had before and what you might get now, which is actually estimating the dopamine response. So just knowing these things, I mean, the bottom line is find out about how the reward system operates if you want to create an engaging game or an engaging learning experience.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
That's the thing that makes the difference. That's the thing that hits neuroplasticity.
Brilliant. And what about this connectivity between, you've talked about grit before and sort of resilience. Where's that? What's happening there? The front.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's fascinating, actually, because I mean, so, we used to say, well, there was this idea that was going around, I think it was called Trium brain theory, that basically you've got like 3 brains, 1, 2, 3. It's very crude, very ridiculous, really. And that these have evolved in evolution, and basically you've got to suppress these lower brains because they're all to do with reptiles. The reptilian brain, have you heard of that?
Yes,
the reptilian
absolutely.
Brain. This is not nonsense, because basically reptiles, humans, fish, we all have 3 parts to our brain. We've had them for a very long time. And what's changed is that, one of those parts are these subcortical structures, which are very important for emotional responding. And what's changed during evolution is that actually the connectivity between those emotional centers and the cortex, which is so important for reasoning, has actually increased. So if we're proud of where we are as a species, it's not because we've managed to get rid and suppress these regions. It's actually because we've got much better communication with them.
I didn't realise
and this is what
that.
you see. Yeah, I mean, this is what you see with people who have better resilience and a better growth mindset. And believe more in getting on and do get on. Those actually are people that have greater connectivity between their striatal regions and the reward regions and the cortex and the rest of us. So it's not about being led by your emotions, and it's not about ignoring your emotions, but it's about being informed by your emotions. And
well, I mean that's really astonishing, because I think probably we may all have fallen for that trap of thinking there's this old reptilian part of the brain that is our emotions that we need to suppress, and the 3-part triune brain seems to be something that has stuck, maybe one of these neuromyths in a way, or I'm sure it evolved from something that was scientific a long time ago. But what you're saying is we've always, all creatures, including humans, have always had these different parts of the brain. It's just that what's changed over time, the evolution that's changed, is the connectivity. Okay.
Yeah, all vertebrates have that basic three-part structure. And of course, sometimes we do need to suppress our emotional regions. We need to regulate our emotions, but sometimes we need to listen to them. So actually, that means we need a quite complex interconnectivity.
And what about? I'm curious about kind of behavioural economics and the theories behind human behaviour. And one of the things that they might say is that it's not persuasive enough to people to just be told some information, unless there's this complementary emotional feeling that goes with it that can kind of tip us over the edge towards a particular behaviour. So I'm curious about whether is the rational kind of prefrontal part of the brain in charge of our behaviour, or really is it this kind of subconscious, maybe more emotive brain or set of functions that's really kind of in the driving seat in terms of our behaviour?
I think the frontal cortex is in charge of telling us that we're in charge.
Thinks it does. Thinks it knows.
It's a typical management sort of smoke screen. No, I mean seriously, I think we now understand that emotions and reasoning are very, very intertwined in the brain. And economic decision making, I mean, one of the first things that was noticed about it was that it was not always rational or logical, and just trying to base predictions on the utility, or the benefit, the value that was available, doesn't seem to explain what people actually do, and so the psychologists have been looking at things like biases and the fact that if you frame a question in a particular way, that's going to change outcomes. But I think now getting the brain involved, we're moving towards much more dynamic models where it's a matter of sampling on a second by second basis, and that informs something which is essentially probabilistic. So it's almost like you've got a roulette wheel in your head, if you like, and what changes is the distribution of the numbers on the roulette wheel, making some more or less likely according to the conditions, and very much according to the recent history of what you've been experiencing. We're quite probabilistic in that sense. I mean, I think, and we're not rational. I mean, I was thinking that only this morning, actually, when I was driving. I just had to drive my kid over very quickly to a PCR test.
Oh yeah.
Sign of the times, and then trying to get him to school. And I felt I wasn't behaving very politely in traffic. And I thought, well, I'm just going to cut across here because I'm in a real hurry. But on the way back, I'm going to be really polite, and that'll make up for it. You suddenly hear yourself thinking that, how on earth does that make sense? So we, the models that we use, we're making sort of decisions all the time, which are essentially irrational and probabilistic, and they're very much based on the moment quite often. And it's a matter of sampling, bringing in information, and adjusting what we're doing accordingly. And some of the rational reasoning that we apply in order to justify that is ridiculous.
Yeah. And
that's what we're learning.
And this is that management side of the brain kind of giving justification to perhaps some of the more emotive stuff that we've acted on, and we didn't even realise we were
post hoc explanations. Crazy
retrospective kind of rationalization.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of decisions that are going on now, in terms of our response to vaccines or climate change or any of these big things, we see people coming to strange conclusions, and a lot of this is about cultural values and the way in which those influence how we feel as well. And I think a really interesting study was done where the visions of leaders were being presented to participants while they were having their brain scanned, and the only difference in the visions that were being presented was whether the participants were told that they represented a particular political party, essentially. So it's exactly the same words, exactly the same message, rationale, everything like that. But they say, this person's a Democrat, or this person's a member of the Labour Party, or whatever. And then you see completely different brain regions activating. So it's not good enough to have just a visionary speech. You have to make sure that the people you're talking to identify with your cultural values if you want them to actually process that message in a way that that you want them to, essentially.
Yeah, no, really interesting. And maybe we can sort of draw to a close around one final question, which is around creativity. And sometimes we don't want people to be answering questions and giving rote answers and, that kind of learning. What we're really doing is encouraging people to make judgments and use their creative kind of capabilities. Where's that happening in the brain?
Well, first of all, we don't have a creative box in the brain. I think that's, which is the creative part of my brain? I don't think you have one. None of us do. So, I mean, there is a region in the right hemisphere, which is actually very important for making divergent connections. So, I mean, that's, I was saying language is left is very largely left lateralized. But if you're making up a creative story, you're definitely going to be seeing, and we've seen this in our own research, regions in the right hemisphere activating. But I think it is a really important question, this, because a lot of, I spend a lot of time talking to people about engaging the learner, building their understanding, and then consolidating it. So they're rehearsing it and making it more permanent. And what you're seeing is a movement of that knowledge, if you like, from working memory, where it's being held temporarily, to becoming consolidated and distributed across the cortex, including in sort of parietal regions where it becomes more automatic. And we generally want that. We generally want learning to become so well rehearsed that we don't even have to think about it anymore. We don't have to put it in our working memory. We actually are accessing it almost unconsciously. That seems to be great. But creativity is an entirely different thing, because actually what we're saying there is that we're forming habits that we just call upon automatically without thinking. And to be creative, you need to jump out of those habits of thinking. So you actually find, when you're asking people to be creative, that they are suppressing activity back here, and what you call the angular gyrus, which is around about there, which is an important region for some automatic processing. In order for them to be creative, they're suppressing the obvious in order for them to, use networks that are going to put them into contact with unusual associations and connections that are not within the problem space. But what's even more interesting is that actually when you're with other people and you're sharing your ideas, you don't need to do that so much. You can reach the same level of creativity without having to put all the work into suppressing these automatic regions. And the likely reason for that is that other people's ideas are disruptive. They stop you from disappearing down those habitual rabbit holes and becoming fixated. So creativity requires, quite often, it's a different set of processes, and not surprisingly, it requires a different set of conditions quite often to bring it about. So most of the time, we're very good at learning the things we need to learn quickly, and more quickly if we're focused, we're in a quiet room, we're on our own, we're being offered some extrinsic rewards, we're on a deadline, that sort of thing. But those creative leaps require almost the exact opposite of that. So if you're having a brainstorming session, you need to make sure that during the time when people are generating the ideas, you're not being evaluated. You are disrupting ideas, maybe by sharing them with each other, maybe by changing the context in which you're working, or maybe going out and having a session in the park rather than around a set of desks. All these things seem to add to creativity. And that's because it's disrupting these automatic associations which your everyday learning has established. So it's really important to realize that it's a different set of processes compared with the more classic analytical reasoning sort of learning, conventional learning and training that we're spending most of our time trying to encourage.
Super, brilliant. And so we've talked about creativity, we've talked a bit about behaviour, we've talked about learning. You've given us a tour of the brain. If there was one thing you would like anybody to come away from today with kind of having realised or understood, what would be the biggest thing that you could hope that people would understand about the brain?
I think the neuroplasticity is possibly the most important thing, because many of us fall into the trap of thinking that the brain is some limit to what we can achieve. My brain can't do that. But actually, the very fact that neuroplasticity exists means that we can construct our own abilities by choosing to expose ourselves to particular experiences, by going along with it. We have free will. And therefore, that's a wonderful thing, because that in itself is motivating. And in fact, studies have shown that when people grasp this idea of plasticity, the idea that their minds are malleable, their brains are plastic and can be changed by their own efforts, that can really improve your self-concept, and it can really improve how much you're able to learn, because you're in charge of constructing your own brain.
Well, that's a brilliant final thought, Paul. Thanks so much for spending your time again with us today. And I look forward to talking to you next time. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.